The hall of the alien palace was huge, with walls that reached the sky and lights that burned like stars. In the center stood the king, tall and proud, his crown glowing with fire. His voice echoed like thunder as he looked down on the crowd. His words were sharp, heavy, and full of pride. Humans, the king said, are weak. They have no honor. They have no strength. They are fit only to kneel and serve. The court of aliens cheered, their voices like a storm. They laughed and shouted, praising their king. But one figure did not kneel. One figure stood alone, still as a stone. A human warrior, dressed in simple armor, his face hidden by shadow. The king's eyes narrowed, his pride wounded by this single act of defiance. He raised his hand, demanding silence from the court. The hall grew quiet, so quiet that even the sound of breath seemed loud. The king's voice cut through the air like a blade. You dare to stand before me? You dare to keep your head high when I demand shame? Do you not fear death? The warrior said nothing. He stood firm, his silence more powerful than 1,000 words. The crowd whispered, some with anger, some with doubt. Why was this human not trembling? Why was he not begging? The king's anger grew. His pride demanded a display of power. He stepped forward, his golden cloak dragging on the floor like fire behind him. Bow, he commanded. Bow to me, accept your shame, and I will spare your kind. His voice shook the walls. His words carried the weight of empire. But still, the warrior stood, silent and unbroken. His eyes shone beneath the shadow of his helmet, like steel reflecting light. The king laughed, a sound cruel and sharp. You are a fool, human. Your kind has always been fools, and today you will pay for your arrogance. The court erupted in laughter again, mocking the lone figure who dared to resist. But beneath their laughter was unease. Something about the warrior's silence unsettled them. He did not shake, he did not move. He was like a mountain, unbending, unbreakable. And in that silence was a question none dared to ask. What gave this human such courage? The king's pride burned hotter. His shame now demanded blood. He raised his staff, energy crackling at its tip, light spilling across the hall. The air grew heavy. The walls trembled. Shadows stretched long and thin. A single strike from the king could tear the warrior apart. But before the blow was struck, the warrior finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet fire. We are not what you believe, he said. We are not weak. We are not broken. We do not kneel. The words echoed through the hall, simple yet unshakable. The king froze, the court stilled. There was no fear in the warrior's tone, no tremble, no plea. It was not the voice of a servant, but the voice of a soldier who had seen battle and survived. The voice of someone who carried the weight of his people. The king's eyes narrowed. His pride demanded he crush this insolence. Yet for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. This was no ordinary human. This was no slave brought in chains. This was something else, something dangerous. The warrior lifted his head fully, the light of the alien stars catching his face. A scar ran across his cheek, his eyes sharp, his jaw set with resolve. He did not look at the king with fear. He looked at him with defiance. The court fell silent, their laughter gone, replaced by unease. In that moment, the hall seemed to shrink. The king, who once towered with pride, felt smaller before the gaze of one man. The silence stretched, heavy as stone, broken only by the warrior's steady breath. The king clenched his fist, shame burning in his chest. This was the moment that would be remembered. The moment when one human, standing alone, dared to defy a king. The court did not yet know it, but the balance of power had shifted. History was about to turn, and it began here with silence, pride, and fire in human eyes. The king's challenge. The hall was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of the king's slow breath. His eyes glowed with pride, yet deep within, a spark of doubt flickered. The human's defiance had spread through the chamber like fire in dry grass. The alien court, once laughing, now whispered in low voices, unsure, uneasy. The king lifted his staff high, the golden crown upon his head shining bright. "Human," he roared, his voice rolling like thunder through the hall. "You dare stand when I order you to kneel? You dare hold your head high when I command shame?" His words echoed against the crystal walls, sharp, heavy, merciless. The warrior remained still, his shadow stretched long under the alien lights. His armor was plain, not glowing with power like the alien guards. Yet something about him, something unseen, carried more weight than any crown. The king stepped closer, each footstep echoing like a hammer. "You are one," the king said, his voice laced with mockery. "Behind you is no army, no fleet, no kingdom, only ashes and dust." He raised his staff, pointing its blazing tip toward the warrior. "But still you dare to resist. Still you dare to shame me in my own hall." The court erupted again, their voices sharp, laughter mixed with anger. But this laughter was thinner than before. It carried less strength. They looked at the warrior not with pure scorn, but with unease. For silence in the face of death is not weakness. It is mystery. The king's pride demanded a test, a challenge that no man could survive. He lowered his staff, and his voice grew cold. "Kneel, and I will grant you mercy. Refuse, and your blood will paint these stones." His words struck the court like a blade. Silence fell again. Still the warrior did not move, his body unshaken. His voice came at last, slow and steady. "I do not kneel," he said. "Not to you, not to any throne, not to any crown." The words were simple, yet they cut deeper than any weapon. The king's hand shook with fury. His shame now demanded blood. His pride was wounded before his court, before his empire. A single human, one voice, had undone the laughter of hundreds. He stepped closer still, his towering figure casting a shadow across the human. "You will bow," the king hissed, "or you will break." He turned to the court, raising his voice high, so all could hear. "Behold this human, fragile, foolish, unworthy. Watch as his pride dies in my hand." The aliens cheered, their voices shaking the hall once more. Yet their eyes betrayed their voices. Some leaned forward, curious, uncertain, as if they wanted to see if the king's words were true. Could this human truly break? Or was there something more hidden within him? Whispers grew again, soft, nervous, questions no one dared ask aloud. The warrior looked up, his gaze meeting the king's. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than the king's roar. It was a silence of defiance, of unyielding strength. And in that silence, the king saw something he did not wish to see. For pride is a fragile thing. It shines bright until it meets a wall that will not move. The king felt that wall in the human's gaze. This was not the look of a slave, not the look of prey. This was the look of an equal, perhaps even a rival. The king raised his staff once more, its tip blazing with energy. The floor cracked, the air trembled, the guards tightened their grip on their weapons. But the warrior did not flinch, not even as the light burned his armor. He stood calm, like a storm waiting to break. The court held its breath, eyes locked on the two figures. A king who ruled worlds, and a human who ruled only himself. It was a challenge not of flesh, but of spirit. The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Who would break first? The king lowered his staff just enough to sneer. "You may stand, but soon you will crawl, and when you do, all will know the shame of your kind." But the warrior's eyes burned brighter, and with a voice steady as stone, he answered, "It will not be my kind who carry shame today." The words fell like a hammer. The king froze, the court gasped. The challenge was set, not of power alone, but of pride. And pride, once challenged, cannot rest, it must fight. The throne hall trembled as the king's rage rose higher. The warrior's silence had become a weapon, and the king, bound by his pride, had no choice but to meet it. The first blow had not yet fallen, but the war had already begun. The warrior's memory. The throne room trembled with unspoken tension. The king stood tall, his staff glowing with fire, his eyes fixed on the lone human. The court leaned forward, waiting, hungry for the king's strike. But the human warrior did not flinch, his silence cut sharper than any blade. The king sneered, his voice low and sharp. You believe yourself strong, human, but strength is not silence. Strength is not pride. It is power, and power belongs to me. His words carried weight, but the warrior's eyes did not waver. For behind those eyes lay more than the present moment. Behind them was memory. The human's mind drifted, just for a breath, back to the world he came from, back to the soil of earth, scarred and broken by war. He remembered the skies burning red, the oceans filled with wreckage. The alien fleets had come like storms, and humanity had been unprepared. Cities had fallen, one after another. Children cried as fire rained from the heavens. The proud monuments of earth, its towers, its bridges, its dreams, all shattered into dust. And in those days, the aliens had laughed the same way they laugh now. The warrior had been young then, younger than the scars on his face. He had watched his home reduced to ashes. He had seen his family vanish into the darkness of war. And in his heart had been carved something deeper than fear, a promise. He had promised that earth would not remain in chains. He had promised that humans would rise, even if blood was the price. He had promised that one day, someone would stand in the heart of the enemy's empire and show them the truth. And now, here he stood, keeping that promise. The king raised his staff higher, lightning of alien power flickering across the chamber. But the warrior's mind was still half in the past. He remembered the training, the hidden camps where survivors gathered. He remembered the broken soldiers who refused to bow. They had no ships, no grand weapons, no empire. They had only scraps of steel, scraps of hope, scraps of faith. But humans are builders, humans are fighters, humans turn ashes into fire. And in the darkness, humanity had forged something new. The warrior's scars told that story. Every cut on his skin was a reminder of battles fought in shadows. Every bruise once carried was proof that humans could take pain and rise again. He was not just a man, he was the memory of Earth itself. The king tilted his head, sensing something hidden. You are strange, the king said. I see no fear in you, only silence. Why do you not tremble, human? The warrior's eyes narrowed, his voice low but steady. Because I remember, he said, I remember what you did to us, and I remember what we became after. The court fell silent, curiosity sparking where mockery once burned. The king's pride did not allow him to admit his unease, but the weight of the human's words pressed against the chamber like an invisible storm. Even the guards shifted, uncertain, as if something unseen stirred within the human. The warrior took a step forward, slow, deliberate. The chains of memory rattled within him, but they did not drag him down. They lifted him. Every step he took carried the ghosts of those who had fallen, and those ghosts whispered not of defeat, but of vengeance. The king slammed his staff against the ground, shaking the hall. Enough of your riddles, human, enough of your silence and memory. Show me your strength if you have any at all. His words were sharp, meant to break the spell of the warrior's calm. But the warrior's gaze held steady, unshaken, unbroken. In his silence, there was not weakness, but warning. For silence is the place where storms are born. And the king, though he would not admit it, felt that storm rising. A storm that had begun long ago on a small blue planet that refused to die. The warrior spoke again, his words like steel. You wanted shame, king, but you will find none in me. You will find only memory, and memory is stronger than your throne. The court gasped, voices hushed in awe and fear. The king's pride flared, but in his heart, the seed of doubt grew deeper. For in the eyes of this single human was the strength of 1,000 battles. In his scars was the truth of a people who did not break. And in his silence was the promise of something greater than the king's pride. The promise that humanity was not finished, not broken, not forgotten. The hall seemed smaller now. The king seemed less certain, less tall, less eternal. And the warrior, though alone, seemed vast, a shadow carrying not just his own weight, but the weight of a whole world. This was the memory of earth, the memory of fire and ashes. And that memory was about to shatter the pride of a king. The next strike would not just be flesh against flesh, but history against arrogance. And the king did not yet know that history always remembers the unbroken. Clash of pride. The throne hall grew darker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The alien king stood high on the steps of his throne, his staff blazing like a burning star. His pride, once untouchable, now trembled beneath the weight of a single man's defiance. The warrior stood still, his shadow long, his silence sharp. The king's voice cracked like thunder. "You dare to shame me before my court, human, then your silence will end in death." His staff lifted high, the air twisted with energy. Bolts of light licked across the ceiling, tearing cracks through stone and crystal. The alien court cried out in awe, their voices rising like waves. They had seen their king destroy armies with less effort than this. No one believed the human would last a single breath. Even the guards, steady and proud, looked at the warrior as if he were already ash. But the warrior did not move, not yet. His hands remained at his side, his gaze steady, his chest rising slow with calm breath. It was not ignorance, not madness, but patience, a patience born from battles fought where waiting meant survival. The king roared and brought his staff down. A storm of raw energy crashed forward, bright as a sun and heavy as a mountain. The floor split apart, flames danced in the air. The sound was like worlds breaking, a strike fit to end an empire. And still, the warrior did not fall. At the last instant, his hand rose plain and bare. The wave of energy slammed into him. The hall exploded with light. The court screamed, blinded, covering their faces from the storm. When the light faded, silence returned. The alien nobles blinked, their eyes wide, their jaws heavy with disbelief. The warrior stood where he had always stood, the floor around him scorched black, but he himself unbroken. Gasps swept the hall like a wind. The king's eyes narrowed, fury burning hotter than fire. "Ow!" he hissed, his voice thin, dangerous. The warrior lowered his hand, slow, calm, as if brushing dust from his armor. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "Pride is not power," he said. "Power is what endures, what survives, what refuses to fall." The words sank into the hall like iron. The alien courtiers shifted uneasily, for never before had anyone spoken such words to their king. The king's pride demanded another strike, fiercer, greater, unstoppable. He lifted his staff again, this time both hands gripping it. The golden crown above his head pulsed with red light. The air shook, walls cracked, shadows bled across the floor. But the warrior moved first for the first time. He stepped forward, one heavy step that echoed like a drumbeat. The air bent around him, though no one could see why. The courtiers leaned back, fear creeping into their eyes. With no glowing staff, no shining crown, the human raised only his arm. But in that moment, the weight of his movement felt greater than the king's storm. His voice rose again, slow, steady, unbroken. "We are not your slaves, and we are not your shame. We are your end." The king struck with rage, the hall filled with light once more. The warrior's arm cut through the blast like a blade through water. A single blow, unseen yet felt by all, shattered the force in front of him. The storm of the king's pride broke apart, scattering into sparks and ash. The chamber gasped as one. The king staggered back a single step. Only one, yet it was enough. Never before had he been forced back. Never before had his strike been undone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, alive, dangerous. The courtiers whispered, voices trembling. Is it possible? Can a human stand against the throne? Can a human defy the crown? Their fear grew, their certainty cracked, and in their eyes the king saw the worst of all betrayals, doubt. The king raised his voice again, hiding the fracture in his pride. This is not victory, human. This is not strength. You are nothing, a shadow, a flicker that I will erase. But his voice shook, his words thin beneath the weight of what had just happened. The warrior, calm and unshaken, took another step forward. Every step was louder than thunder. Every breath a promise that this fight was not like others. The king's pride had been struck, not yet shattered, but cracked. And cracks in pride, once made, cannot be undone. The warrior's silence returned, but this time it was not mystery, it was a challenge. The court felt it, the guards felt it, even the king felt it. It was the silence before the storm, the silence of inevitability. And in that silence, the balance of the galaxy began to shift, for the king's pride had met a wall, and the warrior, with a single blow, had shown that humans were not the weak shadows of history. They were fire hidden in ashes, storms waiting in silence. And for the first time, the king feared that his crown might not shine forever. Humanity's strength. The hall smelled of smoke and fear. The air was thick with the ashes of broken pride. The king stood tall, but his hands trembled on the staff he once held so steady. The court sat frozen, their laughter gone, their voices trapped in their throats. The warrior had not moved much, only a few steps forward. Yet each step had shaken the crown more than an army could. The king's voice broke through the silence, heavy, forced. You think one strike proves anything. You think silence makes you strong, but you're only a man, only a fragile shadow. The warrior lifted his head, his eyes steady, his scars catching the firelight. He did not shout, he did not roar, his voice was calm. But that is where you are wrong, king. The words slid across the chamber like steel against stone. You believe strength is in crowns, in armies, in weapons that burn worlds. He stepped closer, his boots pressing against the cracked floor. But true strength is not in what you hold. It is in what you endure. The court leaned forward, drawn in despite their fear. The warrior raised his arm, showing the old scars etched deep across his skin. These marks are not shame. They're proof that when you try to break us, we did not fall. His voice grew heavier, sharper. You struck our cities, and we built new ones. You burned our homes, and we made fire our ally. You killed our families, and we carried their memory into battle. The king's face darkened, his pride fighting against the words. But the courtiers shifted uneasily, whispers passing like shadows. For in the warrior's voice was not weakness, but a truth that could not be denied. Humans had suffered, yet here stood one, unbroken, stronger than before. The warrior's gaze swept across the chamber. You think shame makes us bow, but shame does not chain us. It shapes us, it becomes our fire. He lifted his hand, curling it into a fist that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 voices. You call us weak, but weakness taught us how to rise. You call us fragile, but fragility taught us how to endure. You call us nothing, but from nothing we built everything. The court was silent, yet the silence was not empty. It was alive. Eyes that once laughed now burned with something else. Not respect, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that these words carried weight beyond one man. The king slammed his staff against the ground, sparks leaping into the air. Lies, he spat. Your kind is small, your kind is fragile, your kind kneels to survive. But his words lacked the thunder they once carried. The court could hear it, the weakness hidden beneath the roar. The warrior's eyes met the king's, sharp as blades. No, he said, voice steady. We kneel for no crown, not yours, not anyone's. The words hit the hall like a storm, and for the first time, the guards themselves shifted, doubt burning in their eyes. The warrior spread his arms, as if carrying the weight of unseen history. We are more than bodies to crush, more than slaves to chain. We are memory. We are promise. We are fire that grows brighter the more you try to smother it. He stepped closer, his shadow falling long across the throne. And when we fight, we do not fight for power. We fight for dignity, for the right to stand, for the right to remain unbroken. The king's jaw tightened, his pride bleeding with every word. But the hall, once his weapon, now betrayed him. Every whisper was like a dagger, every stolen glance a question. Could it be true? Could humanity's strength be greater than the king's pride? The warrior's voice softened, but its edge grew sharper. You call me alone, but I am not alone. I carry the voices of all who fell before me. I carry the fire of all who still live, and I carry the promise that we will never bow. He closed his fist once more, lowering it to his side. That is our strength, king, not crowns, not staffs, not empires, but endurance. The court sat in silence, their eyes locked not on the king, but on the human. It was a silence of shift, a silence of change. The king's pride had been the sun of this chamber, but now another star burned beside it. And in that light, the crown seemed smaller, dimmer, less eternal. The warrior's words hung heavy in the air. They were not shouts, not boasts, not threats. They were truth carved from scars, truth that even the king could not crush. The truth that humanity, broken 1,000 times, had learned how never to break again. The king's grip tightened on his staff, his eyes narrowed, his pride screamed for blood. But deep inside, though he would never say it aloud, he felt the first sting of fear. For power can rule for a time, but endurance rules forever. And endurance had just spoken with the voice of humanity. The turning point. The chamber no longer felt like the king's hall. The throne still towered high, the staff still glowed bright, but the air itself had changed. The court, once loud with laughter and cruel cheers, now sat silent. Their eyes no longer burned with pride for their king, but with unease, with questions they dared not speak aloud. The warrior stood in the center, his armor scarred, his shadow stretched long under the alien fire. He had not shouted, he had not begged, he had only spoken truths carried from the ashes of earth. And those truths, sharp as knives, had cut deeper than the king's staff. Every word still echoed in the chamber, heavy, alive, unshaken. The king tightened his grip on his staff, his jaw locked. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the shift in the court. His pride was bleeding, his crown felt heavy, and in his heart a spark of fear began to burn. He roared to drown it out, his voice tearing through the silence. Do not listen to this shadow. Do not be fooled by his words. He is nothing. His kind is nothing. He raised his staff high, sparks of red lightning spilling across the ceiling. He is a trick, a lie, a fragile flame waiting to be crushed beneath my hand. But his voice, though loud, did not carry the same weight it once did. The courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands. They leaned toward one another, eyes darting, voices soft. What if the human speaks truth? What if strength is not only power? What if the king's pride can be broken? The whispers grew, weaving through the hall like a hidden storm. The warrior turned, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. He did not shout. He did not beg them to believe. He only stood tall, his silence speaking louder than the king's roar. In his stillness was dignity, in his scars was proof, and in his eyes was defiance that no crown could erase. One of the younger nobles, her silver cloak trembling, lowered her gaze from the king. She had never done so before, never dared to turn her eyes away from the crown. Others followed, small at first, then more, until a line of eyes turned, no longer fixed on the king, but on the warrior. The king felt it, and his fury cracked open. He slammed his staff into the floor, the ground shattering under the blow. You dare look away from me, he thundered. You dare give your gaze to a human. His pride burned hotter, but his words no longer held all hearts. The warrior stepped forward, his voice low, calm, unshaken. Fear makes you follow crowns, but truth makes you follow strength. He pointed not at himself, but at the scars across his arm. This is the strength of endurance, the strength to rise when all else is broken. The nobles trembled, for they had never heard such words. Their empire was built on crowns and thrones, on fear and conquest. But here was a man, small in their eyes, who carried no crown, no empire, no army. And yet he bent the hall, shifted the air, and cracked the throne with only words and silence. The king's pride demanded blood, but his spirit felt the weight of doubt. He looked to his court, but their eyes no longer gave him the comfort of loyalty. He looked to his guards, and even they hesitated, their grips tight but unsure. And in that hesitation, the king felt his empire tilt. The warrior did not strike, he did not move. Instead, he let the silence grow, let it spread like roots in the cracks of stone. The silence was not empty, it was heavy, filled with unspoken choice. Would they follow pride, or would they follow truth? The king bared his teeth, rage boiling. You think you win by words. Human, you think doubt will save you, but I will crush you before their eyes, and their fear will return. He lifted his staff again, ready to strike. But the warrior's calm voice broke through the rising storm. You may strike me down, king, but if you do, they will remember that I stood, and that you feared me. The words cut deeper than steel. The court gasped, the guards hesitated, and the king's hand shook on the staff. For even he knew, fear could rule, but memory could not be killed. The silence grew once more. It was no longer the silence of mystery, it was the silence of choice. And in that silence, the throne no longer seemed eternal. The king, who once stood like a god, now looked smaller, fragile, chained by his own pride. The turning point had come, though no blade had yet fallen. The court had seen doubt, the guards had felt hesitation, and the king had felt fear. And the warrior, scarred and steady, had shown them that humanity's strength was not in crowns, but in the fire that refuses to die, the fire that spreads even in silence. The king raised his staff high, rage burning in his eyes. But the court no longer looked at him with certainty. They looked at him with doubt, with fear, with cracks in their loyalty. And in those cracks, the throne itself began to shake. The war for pride was no longer only between king and warrior. It was now in the hearts of every soul in the chamber. And that war, once begun, could not be stopped. The king had power, but the human had something stronger, the spark of change, the legacy. The hall had never been this quiet. The crown still glowed above the king's head. The staff still burned with fire, but their light no longer felt eternal. The court sat frozen, their whispers silenced, their eyes caught between the king on his throne and the human who stood unbroken before it. The weight of pride, the weight of memory, the weight of truth, all of it hung heavy in the air. The king's chest rose with furious breath, his pride demanding one last strike. His staff trembled in his grip, lightning crawling across the floor. He wanted to crush the human, to erase him, to remind all that no voice could stand against a crown. But deep within, behind the fire, behind the fury, there was fear. The warrior stood calm, his armor cracked, his scars shining under the alien light. He had not raised a sword, he had not called for an army. Yet he had forced the king back, forced the court into silence. And with only words, scars, and silence, he had cracked the throne. The king roared, his voice tearing across the chamber. You are nothing, human, nothing but dust. You cannot break me. You cannot break a crown. His fury echoed, but it was weaker now, hollow. The court did not cheer. The guards did not shout. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The warrior lifted his head, his voice low, steady, cutting through the silence. I do not need to break your crown, king. Your pride is already broken. The words struck harder than any blade. The king staggered a step, as if struck by the weight of truth itself. Gasps rippled through the court. Never before had anyone spoken to the king like this. Never before had anyone survived defiance. But here stood a human, unbroken, and every soul in that hall knew history was being written before their eyes. The crown no longer seemed untouchable. The king no longer seemed eternal. The warrior turned, his gaze sweeping across the nobles, the guards, the court. "You saw me stand," he said. "You saw me endure. Remember this moment. Remember that pride can fall and that dignity cannot be crushed." His voice carried like a flame in the dark. It was not only for them, but for the future, for those who would hear the story when the hall was dust. Some nobles lowered their heads, shame burning in their eyes. Others leaned forward, caught by the fire in the human's words. And among the guards, hands tightened on weapons, not with loyalty to the king, but with doubt. The crack in the throne was no longer invisible. It was spreading. The king tried to speak, but his voice failed him. For every word the human spoke, every silence he carried, turned the weight of the hall against the crown. The king's empire still stood, his staff still burned, but his authority had already begun to slip. Pride had been his shield, and now that shield was shattered. The warrior stepped back, slowly, his head still high. He did not strike the king. He did not claim the throne. He did not demand surrender. Instead, he gave the king something far worse than defeat. He gave him mercy. For mercy from the weak is nothing, but mercy from the unbroken is unbearable. The warrior's final words cut through the hall like a scar across history. "This is not the end, king. This is only the first blow. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not vanish. We rise." He turned his back to the throne. And in that act, in that fearless turning away, the hall itself trembled. The king stood frozen, his pride bleeding, his court fractured. He could not strike, for to strike would admit fear, and fear had already been seen. He could not speak, for his words would carry no weight. So he stood in silence, trapped within the crown he once believed eternal. The warrior walked toward the great doors of the chamber. Each step echoed like thunder, like the march of something greater than one man. The guard did not move to stop him. Their eyes lowered, their grips loosened. For even they knew, this man carried more than himself. He carried the strength of a world. When the doors opened, the light of alien suns spilled across the floor. The warrior walked into it, his shadow stretching far. Behind him the hall was silent, but the silence was no longer loyal. It was the silence of change, the silence of something broken and something new being born. The king lowered his gaze for the first time in his reign. The crown still burned, but its fire felt dim. His pride, shattered by a single blow, would never shine as it once did. And deep within, he knew the truth he would never speak. The human had won. The warrior did not look back. He carried with him the memory of Earth, the promise of humanity, the fire that could not be smothered. And though he walked alone, he was not alone. For behind him walked history, and ahead of him waited destiny. The hall would remember, the court would remember, the galaxy would remember. The day a king demanded shame, and a human shattered his pride with a single blow. And though the battle was done, the war had only begun. For humanity's legacy was no longer silence. It was fire,